and the liberal response to sort of wants to treat Trump as this unique evil that has sort of like emerged almost out of nowhere, and now that he's gone, we can sort of go back to normal, go back to brunch or whatever. I think that's wrong, but I do think people were right to note that this was a uniquely what was being created by the 4 years of the Trump administration was horrifying to see. The increasing detachment from reality, the stoking of groups like QAnon. I mean, this is not good stuff. I remember seeing a poll that was floating around social media at one point that said, asked a question that was like, this is maybe 2 or 3 months ago, number of coronavirus deaths, acceptable or unacceptable? And some overwhelming percentage of Democrats said unacceptable, and a majority of Republican respondents said acceptable. And to me, if that's the terrain upon which we're operating, just this open-armed embrace of the sweet release of death, like let the bodies pile up to the sky, it's all fine, like anything is any amount of death and stuff, whatever. I mean, that's really grotesque and horrifying, and we should all be very glad that project was stopped. But I worry, precisely because of what I was talking about with the Democratic Party earlier, the shape of the Democratic Party at this moment, that Trump is not the last that we have seen of this kind of politics, particularly in the face of such a weak T opposition from the Democratic Party. I mean, as long as we don't have a party that is actually speaking to the multiple overlapping crises that are engulfing the society and the planet right now, it offers these opportunities up to figures like Trump, or even more terrifying, the next person who comes along who is not a Keystone Cop type, who is actually coherent, who actually doesn't fire their staff new staff every other day, who can actually like keep their attention on something for more than 5 minutes, and can actually use some of the kind of raw right-wing populist exhortations that Trump used, but do it in a competent way. I mean, we should all be terrified of that. Trump did not accomplish very much in his 4 years in the White House. The most substantive positive achievement, positive in the sense of actually doing something, we can point to was his gigantic tax cut for the rich. But besides that, he really did not do the kind of damage that, say, the last Republican president before him did, George Bush, right? He didn't invade a foreign country and engulf the region in blood for years and decades, for example. He through his negligence, of course, he helped lead to the deaths of more than 250,000 people, but he didn't actively do anything that led to that kind of bloodshed. But if you had somebody else who, as I said, is more competent, if you had the competence of the Bush administration with the right-wing populist appeal of the Trump administration, that is a terrifying thought to behold, and I worry that could be in our very near future.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a very interesting concept of someone like, do you think the politics of someone like a Josh Hawley, or the very much antagonistic of the elites on Twitter, a very tough rhetoric taking on against things like China and big tech, do you think that kind of politics will break through and it'll be the future of the GOP and really resonate with people? Or like, what do you see the future brand of the GOP?
Well, this is a question that many people who are far smarter than me are wrestling with right now. I mean, there are clearly multiple paths coming out of this. I mean, on the one hand, Josh Hawley is of a type who's trying to beat one kind of path, that is that kind of right-wing populist path. There will be some people who try to bring the party back to its golden, quote unquote, pre-Trump reactionary days. I don't think that there is an immediate future for much of those kind of politics. I mean, clearly, like when you've got Republican voters, a majority of them in a poll saying, "Let everybody die," more coronavirus deaths, the better. There's not much of a stomach for Mitt Romney style Republican politics, but the Hawley types are. I mean, they're the ones who are really we should be keeping an eye on. That there's so much. Trump has shown that is a very rich veined tap, and so we can assume that there's going to be much more of that, and in some ways, some more horrifying versions of that kind of right wing populism coming.
Yeah, and I did think it was interesting that we kind of saw that maybe a little bit manifesting through the results of the 2020 election, where we saw these losses of minority voters in a way that was not very large. Of course, the large majority of minority voters still did support the Democratic Party and Joe Biden, but especially in very key areas, for example, mostly southern Florida and southern Texas, that probably may have cost Joe Biden success in these states because of his turnout elsewhere in suburban areas was so high. All he really needed was those kind of traditional Democratic Latino voters to come out and support him, and they didn't. Do you think that does that worry you in terms of the future of the Democratic Party and their ability to resist figures that could come down the line?
Yes, I think that is something that is another product of the Democrats' refusal to adopt a robust working class agenda, combined with the fact that there is this clear belief that has been present for years at this point that voters of color are some kind of monolith and that the Democrats just have those on lock, and there's something congenital to black and brown people that makes them vote for Democrats, and that can never be dislodged. And I remember thinking about this before the election results even came, like listening to the RNC, for example, the Republican National Convention, and hearing it was clearly a top line priority item for the Republicans to have speakers of color at the RNC talking very explicitly about why the Republicans are not in fact racist, but are their home as a voter of color, whoever was speaking. In some cases, outflanking the Democrats from the left in some ways on some issues like prison reform and ending mass incarceration. Of course, all those appeals were hollow, but they were pretty good at putting people up on stage who made you think that maybe they weren't so hollow. And this is the fruit of several decades worth of Democrats just assuming that votes from people of color are theirs, and that there is some kind of inborn an inborn Democrat as a Democrat gene. The racial science is that people of color in this country are born with the Democrat gene, and to add to that, not just that there's that Democrat gene, but that some hollow appeals on identity, sort of like speaking the right phrases that are determined by sort of like diversity consultants or whatever within the Democratic Party, that is what voters of color want, is to say the right words on the right things or whatever, and they will be a combination of that with the Trump administration's obviously horrific reactionary policies and in many cases racist policies on questions like immigration, that just means that automatically that will turn into Democratic votes from black and brown voters. And we saw that is not the case, just in the same way that we saw in 2016 that people thought that Hillary Clinton running for the presidency would obviously produce a landslide of female votes for Hillary Clinton. That was not the case. Like a majority of at least of white women, if I remember correctly, voted for Trump over Hillary Clinton. And so this kind of, there's this demographics is destiny argument that is so prevalent within the Democratic Party, And this should be the results of this election should be a real wake-up call to the party to realize that that's not the case. And in fact, what voters of color, again with the heavy air quotes around that phrase, want substantively is the same as what working class voters of all kinds want. There needs to be a substantive working class agenda that will prevent the Republicans from making these kind of incursions into the Democratic Party base that are able to, in the near future, obviously there's not going to be for example, a majority of black voters turning to Republicans. But I think we are going to continue to see the kind of appeals that we saw from the Republicans during Trump's administration for voters of color who are they're going to say to them, like, we are not racist. And in fact, like, these Democrats want to, talk down to you or don't believe that they actually have to deliver you anything substantive. We're going to keep hearing that kind of rhetoric. And I unless something significant changes, I think there's going to continue to be important minorities of those coalitions, important, small percentages of those coalitions that are cleaved off and won to the Republicans. And that Democrats should be very disturbed by the fact that is where the vote totals seem to be going.
Would you say the Democrats need to worry about a more kind of positive vision that the Republicans may be able to present? Because it does kind of seem like just generally the way the Republican Party is, they can't really say too much that they're actually going to be able to do for these voters without really kind of pissing off their much more populist white base, with the evangelical voters and all that. So what is if there is any, what is the appeal that is kind of the positive appeal that the GOP can make to voters of color or have made?
Well, that's what is the positive appeal. I mean, the whole Republican agenda at this point isn't much of a positive agenda. It is, as many people have said, there literally was no Republican platform this year. The platform seemed to be own the libs. So that if that's the platform, if that is what the party stands for, and they're still able to command the kind of, they're able to get 70 million people or however many people to vote for Donald Trump. I mean, they're gonna keep going. That they don't need to offer anything positive because the Democrats aren't offering anything positive either. And so that is another sort of dystopian vision of where our politics are going. Is sort of like a lack of a positive agenda from anyone. There are just these sort of hollow cultural appeals going back and forth. And nothing ever changes. Everything gets worse. Our lives continue to be immiserated, and that's why the Democratic Party, there's such an opening here. It seems so clear to me. I don't understand why the Democrats refuse to take it, because the advancing of a positive agenda, especially one rooted in dealing with the wrenching economic pain that so many people are dealing with right now, is to me the only thing that is an adequate pushback against that agenda of owning the libs. Like if you just operate on that cultural terrain, that sort of libidinal terrain, owning the libs is fun for people, and they're going to keep choosing that. If they have to choose between two hollow cultural appeals and one of them is owning the libs, they're probably going to go with that. So Democrats need to put forward something actually tangible and substantive to actually push back against that.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about some of the ways to push that back, and probably one of our personal favorite, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening to the show, I assume, would agree, is kind of more left-wing politics, and that path can be different for a lot of people. I'm just curious, what was your first kind of introduction from maybe getting into politics and maybe going from more liberal to more left-wing to socialist? Well,
my path, I'm 32 years old, and my path was pretty common for people who came to radical politics, pre Bernie Sanders in the late 90s, 2000s. which was I, as a teenager, got involved in the punk scene in West Michigan where I grew up, which exposed me to anarchism and